So my name is Colleen Hunt with Stone Creek Environmental Consulting, and I focus on municipal stormwater management, particularly around the state of California's National Pollution Discharge Elimination System program for municipal stormwater requirements. And so it's 9 o'clock, so I'm going to roll into the presentation here. Happy to be participating in Stormwater Awareness Week, which is just such a great resource for our stormwater community. So thank you for having that available and so easily accessible. This training is on municipal stormwater best management practices for public agencies. And this is my contact information. So feel free if you have any questions after the training today, just feel free to reach out to me anytime. So this training is going to be basically in 3 parts. This first part is the introduction, and this is actually like the last slide on the introduction, just kind of who I am and what we're going to be discussing today. The second module is going to be on stormwater terms and concepts and regulatory background. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the regulatory background. I really want to get into the technical work and information around best management practices for public agencies. But I think it's important, since we have such a diverse group, this training, is accessible to people all throughout the United States and beyond. And so want to make sure that we just have the basic framework of where some of these municipal requirements come from. And I'm also really big on making sure we're talking about terms in the same way. And I think in our industry, there's some terms that get used interchangeably that really aren't. So the stormwater terms and concepts, it's going to be very basic. I just want to make sure that as I move through the presentation, we all have a kind of a baseline understanding of how I'm using these terms. And then our third module is going to be the bulk of our time here today in terms of talking about municipal stormwater requirements and specifically around best management practices. So let's jump in with stormwater terms and concepts. So the training objectives here are really to understand basic stormwater terms, how stormwater behaves, and identify pollutants of concern in stormwater runoff in your jobs. And so this training, probably should have said this in the introductory slides, but this training is really geared towards municipal staff who have maintenance responsibilities or are otherwise involved in activities that occur in managing a municipality or running a city or a county in terms of different types of activities. So we'll look at identifying pollutants of concern based around those specific types of jobs. So as I said, this is all going to be very basic, but want to make sure that we all have a common baseline understanding of how I'm using these terms in this training. So stormwater, water that's generated during a rain event. Receiving water, that's going to be any river, stream, creek, or body of water that receives stormwater as a discharge. So we have some type of stormwater conveyance system that is connected directly to some type of natural water body. We're going to refer to that today as receiving water. MS4 is a common acronym used to describe the storm drain system, and the acronym stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer Systems. And what this is really emphasizing is that stormwater is not being discharged to a sanitary sewer system for treatment. And so when we talk about an MS4, what we're really talking about is stormwater that is connected directly to receiving water. Some terms that play a very important role on how stormwater behaves has to do with impervious surface or pervious surface. So impervious, any surface in which water cannot infiltrate. Impervious surface, we look at any surface in which water can infiltrate. When you dig really far into kind of some engineering around infiltration and runoff rates and things, you don't ever have 100% impervious surface or 100% pervious, but for the purposes of today, that's how we're going to think about our landscape is, just whether or not generally, a paved area is going to be impervious where an open grass field is going to be pervious. And then finally, we have the term urbanization, which is talking about a large amount of people in a relatively small area. And small area might be a little subjective in terms of, Los Angeles is an urbanized area, and Los Angeles certainly isn't a small area. But when you look at the density of the amount of people that live in Los Angeles relative to the area, we're looking at that as a highly urbanized area. And then I'll use the term BMP, frequently standing for best management practices, which I'll define further in the training. All right, so stormwater is going to do one of three things when it rains. If it lands on a pervious surface, it's going to generally infiltrate into the ground. If it lands on a pervious surface that's at a low elevation or a depressed elevation, it may pond and eventually evaporate. And then if we have stormwater that lands on an impervious surface that has any kind of sloped elevation, even minor, we're going to have runoff. And so that's really the rain that's generated on an impervious surface that's going to run from a high elevation to a low elevation. So as we all know, water is always going to roll downhill. And so we look at runoff as being, thinking about some type of slope that's going to run off to a defined point. And as I said before, we have rivers, creeks, and streams are receiving water that receive our stormwater runoff, and there is usually no treatment. And so there are some municipalities, and I'm in California, so I'm most familiar with kind of the California system, and most municipalities in California do not send their stormwater to the sanitary sewer. I don't know how stormwater is usually engineered in other states or other countries, but for today, we're going to be talking primarily with the assumption that your stormwater is not treated and goes directly to some type of receiving water. And so because of that, so we have these impervious surfaces that when it rains and we have stormwater generate runoff on an impervious surface, that water will convey any pollutants that are within that impervious surface. And so this is where we get pollutant sources. So this is just a cartoon that kind of shows some different pollutant sources and how that might interact with our natural environment, particularly our receiving waters. And we do have, direct discharges in this system. And then also right here where we have this little paved area is trying to convey that, pollutants that are generated in this paved area goes in the storm drain to the outfall and into our rivers and creeks. So that's the concept we're operating under in terms of what we do on the land is going to impact our water quality. Some common pollutants related to urban pollutants and stormwater runoff include oils, petroleum, grease, nutrients from fertilizers or soaps, pesticides and herbicides, trash, sediment, organic matter like our leaves, inorganic pollutants like copper, lead, and zinc, and household hazardous waste products. So stormwater regulations, as I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I do just want everyone to have a relative background on where requirements come from related to stormwater management. And just ask that as we go through these slides, think about your own organization that you work for and represent, and kind of ask yourself the question, do you know if your municipality has an MS4 permit? Are you aware of the requirements in there? And that can kind of help formulate, as we talk about the best management practices in this training, help you gauge if these are required or if these are just common practices that you should be using for the better good of the community. But I would like to emphasize that if you're working for a municipality and you don't know if they are regulated under a MS4 permit or municipal stormwater permit, you should, I encourage you to investigate and find out. These are federal requirements, which I'll get into. So if you're in the United States, there's a very good chance, if you're in the United States and you work for a municipality, there's a very good chance that they're subject to these requirements. So let's just go through kind of how these regulations came about. And ultimately in the 1990s, the EPA started to study the correlation between poor water quality in areas that were largely populated or highly urbanized. And what they found is that contamination or receiving water quality is more significant in areas with larger amounts of people. And there's really two reasons for this. One, if you think about an urbanized area, there is a lot of pavement. Pavement is generally impervious. And so the more a city is developed, and the more impervious surface you have, the more runoff you have. And so so collectively, that runoff can create mobilization of pollutants. And then of course, the more people you have, the more pollutant use you have. And so you're introducing more pollutants into your environment when you have an urbanized area with lots of industry, lots of residents, and just more people, more chemical use, etc. So the federal government, the EPA, under the Federal Clean Water Act, created the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES system. And this is essentially developing a permit to municipalities for the discharge of their stormwater runoff from their conveyance system to waters of the United States. So these requirements apply to any, well, I'll go over the criteria in the next slide, but they apply to municipalities who don't treat stormwater runoff at their treatment plant. So if you represent an agency that does convey stormwater to the treatment plant, you're likely not under an MS4 permit. I've heard of exceptions, but just kind of speaking high level and generally. So NPDES permits are implemented under the authority of the state. So whatever state you reside in or work in, that EPA has delegated a state agency to issue NPDES permits. And there's a few states that don't have that delegation, but for the most part, it's the common regulating entity is going to be a state agency. So under the stormwater permit requirements, the federal EPA mandated minimum control measures. And basically, the minimum control measures are required to be in every municipal stormwater permit or MS4 permit. And while these permits from state to state and even within the state vary, and the requirements can be highly variable, as a baseline minimum, every stormwater permit is going to have a public education and outreach section, construction, post-construction, illicit discharge, and municipal operations. And sometimes municipal operations is referred to as good housekeeping or pollution prevention. And so any municipality within the United States that has a population of over 10,000 people is likely going to have an NPDES permit regulating stormwater discharges within that municipality. There are some exceptions. We've already discussed municipalities who direct their stormwater to a sanitary sewer system. There are also some other exemptions that I'm not going to get into today, but for the purposes of, kind of a high level overview, if you work for a municipality with over 10,000 people, the population is over 10,000 people, you most likely have a municipal stormwater permit with requirements for municipal operations to control pollutants in stormwater runoff. So we're going to shift over to kind of talking about that in some more detail. So when we look at the stormwater requirements for municipal operations, public agency activities, good pollution prevention, good housekeeping, however it's phrased in your specific stormwater permit, you're likely looking at two types of activities that are regulated. First, there is, and those are based on being pollutant generating. So there's two categories of pollutant generating activities that are occurring at the municipal level. So first, there may be pollutant generating activities that are at your public facilities. So a corporation yard is a great example of where we usually see pollutant generating activities. And I'm going to talk more about what pollutant generating activities are, but this might be having a fuel tank, storing chemicals, vehicle washing, things like that. So some common practices that not done correctly may result in a discharge of pollutants to the storm drain system. Then we have job activities. So these might not be specific to a public facility, although some are, because we do look at building maintenance activities as potentially being pollutant generating. But some of these activities may be part of your day-to-day job that don't necessarily occur at a corp yard or a public pool. And so one of the biggest activities is road paving or any kind of road maintenance activities that might involve the potential discharge of pollutants to the storm drain system. And so thinking about, activities that you are responsible for within your jurisdiction that are kind of around and about town. So we're going to look at these in further detail. So kind of digging back into pollutant generating activities that are common to public facilities. Now, there could be activities not listed here. These are some examples. These are the most common ones. In my work, these are the activities I've come across most frequently when helping municipalities with, say, a facility pollution prevention plan and identifying, okay, at this facility, what are all the different pollutant generating activities? These are going to be some of the more common. In the state of California, in the NPDES municipal stormwater permits I work on, the regulations define which activities require best management practices. So if I have a client here in California, I can go to their permit and look at this section, and it will say, if you do any of these activities at a public facility or at a job site, you are required to implement best management practices. So the activities that are regulated for your municipality, again, because we have such a diverse group here geographically, I can't say specifically if all states include a specific list, but in California, the permits I work with do. And so it's very helpful to go through and say, okay, these are all of our requirements, and this is what we're regulated to do. And then as a reference, there are manuals throughout the state. The most popular one is Caltrans maintenance manual. And so Caltrans is our State Department of Transportation here in California. They do a lot related to stormwater, and they have a very thorough manual that looks at all the pollutant generating activities for maintenance activities. And then not only do you get a list of the activities that should have BMPs, it will also tell you what those BMPs are. This is a very helpful resource in terms of managing your activities. So for the purposes of understanding which activities are regulated for your municipality, you'd want to start by looking at your permit and seeing if it's defined there, and then using a manual of some type as a resource to determine which best management practices you need to implement and for which activities. So as we move through these slides, think about, if you have access to certain resources to really kind of dive into the details here of what's required. So back to public facilities, these are going to be activities that are common at public facilities. So vehicle, equipment, and cleaning, fueling, maintenance, and repair, again, kind of that core corporation yard type activities, chemical storage, including hazardous materials, hazardous waste storage, and washing activities. And we're going to talk a little bit about washing activities, but this is in particular, at least in the state of California, wash water being discharged down the storm drain is very, very restrictive. And so I kind of like to highlight washing activities to make sure that if you are in California, you are aware of how restrictive some of the discharge prohibitions are in a municipal stormwater permit. And if you're outside the state of California, I would encourage you to look into, if you don't know, what are the restrictions on washing activities within your jurisdiction. So that's facilities. Now let's move over to job activities. So certainly these can occur at facilities, but they're more broad than that. And so we talk about them as a separate category of pollutant generating activities. And within all of these different categories, there are subcategories. And so in one of the municipal stormwater permits that I work in, these are all listed as are their subcategories, so that I can go in and look and say, okay, For landscaping, there's about a half a dozen, breakdown of categories for different types of landscaping, and then best management practices for each of those. For today, we're not going to get into that level of detail. I think the takeaway for this training is to one, be able to recognize what job activities you're doing that might be pollutant generating, and identify what best management practices you need to implement in order to complete that activity without creating stormwater pollution and pollutant generating runoff. And so when we look at these pollutant generating activities, we're going to use best management practices to result in what we hope is clean water at the end of the pipe. So we're going to shift over now into best management practices. We're going to look at some specific activities and suggested best management practices to accomplish clean water in your jobs. So I've done this training in particular around municipal operations for years, and I usually show this slide last. And I decided this time, like, maybe I should show this slide first. And so this is really a takeaway. If you don't learn anything else from me today, this is kind of the bottom line about what we're trying to accomplish with stormwater management and best management practices. And that is inlet protection. And so when you're working, whether it's at a facility or a job activity, if you have awareness around where your inlets are and what your pollutants are, you can likely apply any kind of logic to what you think you need to do to prevent pollutants from entering that inlet. And just, I think having that awareness goes a really long way. When we look at the Caltrans manual, it's like 700 pages long, and it has, hundreds of BMPs for dozens of different activities. And that can be a little overwhelming to store all that information and then recall it when you're doing a certain job activity. And so I think it's really important if you can take away this concept of what you're mandated to do, and it's to protect that inlet and to work your activities to have that inlet protected, you're going to have a very successful implementation of best management practices in your work. So the pictures here in the slide, these pictures you'll see on other slides as we move through. You'll also hear some of these concepts repeated. And that's because for a lot of these pollutant generating activities, the BMPs are going to be very comparable. And they're all mostly based on inlet protection. And they're taking concepts, and so if we look at the top picture with the leaves, so if you're working at a public park and your job is the landscape maintenance at a public park, it's to take, the debris and handle it in such a way that it's not vulnerable to going down that inlet. So can you make stockpiles of debris in locations that is not going to be subject to the inlet, going into the inlet? Can you keep things covered to prevent it from going into the inlet? Can you cover the inlet? Same with, we're going to work clockwise around the screen. A big push is to cover loads. And so if you're taking that debris from the park back to your courtyard or a compost facility or wherever its final destination is, it should be covered so it's not blowing around and then being subject to being exposed into the storm drain system at some other location. We're going to talk about certain activities that we don't want to do right before it rains. Usually these involve some type of chemical, and we don't want to subject the chemical to being mobilized during a rain event. We'll talk about washing activities and appropriate places to wash equipment or vehicles. Spill kits. This comes up with a lot of different activities that if you're using any kind of fuel or petroleum product, to have a spill kit on hand. Likely if there is a spill, it could be minor or incidental. And so it's really easy, just pull out a spill kit, use the absorbent, dispose of that properly, and move on. Now, more catastrophic spills, you're not going to be able to use a spill kit for, but if you have, say, some type of gas-powered equipment, and if you have some type of gas-powered equipment and you have some leaks of the containers storing your fuel or in transferring from the container to the equipment, you should probably have a spill kit on hand and using that if you have incidental spills or leaks. And then stockpile management, similar to the debris. What can you do with a pile of soil that doesn't make it vulnerable to being discharged down the storm drain? So I'm going to go through a few common BMPs for facilities and what we kind of what's common ways of managing chemicals and different activities at a facility. So chemical storage, most BMP manuals are going to say store all your chemicals indoors. Oops. Sorry, I think this is on an auto advance, so we'll try and deal with that. Store chemicals indoors. So don't even have them in an area that is exposed to stormwater. So if it's outside, it should be under cover. You want to have all your equipment stored properly with the lids on. You don't want open buckets, something that is subject to being knocked over and then possibly discharging down the storm drain. The best solution here is really to put everything inside and just abate any exposure to stormwater. Fueling, we want to make sure that our fuel sorry, there was a sound clip on that slide, but fueling, we want to make sure that we're having BMPs associated with our fuel storage. Now, fuel storage is interesting because if you're in the state of California and you are storing more than 55 gallons of fuel, I'm going to fix this. If you're storing more than 55 gallons of fuel, you are going to be subject to hazardous material business plans, which also have spill requirements in your plan. What happens if you have a spill of a hazardous material? Also, federally, then, if you are storing oil above an aggregate of 1,320 gallons in an above ground storage tank or some type of above ground system, you're going to be subject to the spill prevention, control, and countermeasure. And that requirement is also going to have spill pollution and prevention measures. So fuel kind of is regulated under a few different arms, and your best management practices are going to be dictated really by what some of those other plans say. So sorry that slide wasn't available to show. Washing. So as I mentioned before, in the state of California, washing is a very restricted activity. Most NPDES permits in the state of California, to my knowledge, prohibit the discharge of wash water to the storm drain system. In fact, these permits are so restrictive, they actually prohibit the discharge of potable water to the storm drain system. And so even if you're just rinsing off a car or hosing or power washing a building, these are all pollutant generating activities, and that wash water is not going to be allowed down the storm drain system. And so best management practices around these types of activities are very restrictive, and it's very important to know what's allowable and what isn't. And so most municipalities that are under these strict requirements have to have a designated washing area. So the area I'm showing in this picture is plumbed to the sanitary sewer. So any washing that occurs in this washing bay is not going to result in a discharge of wash water to the storm drain system. So it's really important for municipalities that are under some of these strict requirements to know where they can wash. You can't, if you're out at a job site and you have, I don't know, something on the car and you want to hose it down, you can't do that. You've got to go to a designated area that is not connected to the storm drain system. So this plays an important role in how business is done and how these operations are done. And I'll just say as an aside, this is at one of my clients' facilities, and they have this, wash bay plumbed to the system. And I was there once to do some work, and I saw someone washing not in the bay. And so, it's easy to forget, or, if you're not trained properly. And what they were doing had more to do with the water out of the hose going down, not so much pollutants. And so it's hard if you don't know what these restrictions are. It's really hard to keep up with, because it's not intuitive to think that the water that comes out of a hose, well, that's the same water I drink inside my house. Like, why can't that go down the storm drain? It's not intuitive. And just for your own information, the reason for that is if the water's chlorinated, chlorine is highly toxic to aquatic life. And so that is kind of the basis for some of these really strict restrictions around what is referred to in the NPDES world as a non-stormwater discharge. Another BMP at our facilities or even at your job sites is proper disposal, and making sure that you are disposing of chemicals appropriately and according to regulations. So if it's considered a hazardous waste, that you're, following those protocols. And then one of the more effective BMPs at our facilities is just a simple inspection. And this can be done by a designated person at some frequency. And so when you go to like the Caltrans manual, it's going to tell you, well, here is the inspection frequency we recommend for this activity. So again, for like above ground storage tank fueling, your SPCC or your HMBP requirements are going to have a very strict inspection regimen. But the BMP manual is also good at saying, here's how frequently you should inspect different types of areas at your facilities. And what that allows is early detection of a problem. And so if you're doing a walkthrough and you see a chemical stored outside and it's a 5-gallon bucket and there's a mystery liquid in there, which is now addressing other requirements for proper labeling, you can address that before it becomes a problem. So frequent inspections is something that's very encouraged if your facility has pollutant generating activities. So for these last couple slides, I'm going to go through the different types of landscape requirements. I think sometimes we don't necessarily think of landscaping as being particularly pollutant generating. I think sometimes pollutant has this connotation of something that's hazardous or very dangerous to human health. But we're also looking at, sediment and debris and those types of pollutants that are defined as being pollutants in stormwater runoff. So for grounds maintenance, some common BMPs is to sweep and not power wash, to have appropriate chemical applications, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, to manage erosion and sediment control, as we talked about stockpiling management, and then for over irrigation, as I talked about with the non-stormwater discharges, you want to affix and address any over irrigation of your system to avoid runoff of irrigation water. And that kind of gets into a lot of, in California, we're very aware of drought measures and water reducing measures. And so that is kind of a twofer where you protect stormwater quality, but then over irrigation can also be an excessive use of water. So kind of addresses both of those. So for chemical vegetation, I referenced the Department of Pesticide Regulation here in California. That is going to be the default regulatory agency on how pesticides are required to be applied, and their certifications around that. But from a water quality perspective, we can look at some best management practices to make sure that we're not exposing our potential runoff to pesticides or herbicides. So in the picture here, we have someone applying chemicals while there's some irrigation happening. We want to avoid that. We want to avoid our chemicals being subject to water and creating runoff, right? And so it goes back to that concept of not wanting to apply chemicals right before a rain event. We want to apply chemicals again within that mind of what can I do to protect the drain inlet. There's BMPs around adjusting the spray nozzle, and so that it's being applied appropriately and on just the areas that it's needed. There's best management practices on following the label and the instruction on the label, and mixing. Some pesticides need to be mixed. So if you're mixing those out in the field, to do that safely so there's no spillage or leaks. And if there is, that you have the equipment necessary to clean that up. And then for these activities, so we have manual vegetation control, pruning and chipping, mechanical vegetation control. These all generally have the same BMPs. And so it's, being aware of the storm drain and not leaving the clippings or debris in an area that's exposed to the storm drain. Same with if your chipping activities. Talked about stockpile management already. We talked about covered loads, washing equipment in the appropriate places. And really, again, the emphasis is really, are you aware of where the storm drains are, and are you conducting your activities in a manner that is protecting that storm drain from pollutants? In irrigation, there are certain practices around irrigation that we want to make sure we're addressing potential pollutants generated with the irrigation system. Really, focused on fixing leaks should be a priority. not only is it wasteful for water, but it can be a source of pollutant generation, protecting inlets, preventing overspray, etc. So in review, as we're kind of coming to a close on our hour and hopefully allowing time for questions, you may be working in a municipality that has a permit that requires pollutant generating activities to be controlled to prevent pollutants from being discharged into a storm drain. So if you don't know what the requirements are for where you work, I really encourage you to find out. And then under those permits, we are mandated to implement best management practices to control pollutants. And whether or not you have a permit, just for the better good of the community, these are some common practices. You know, some of these things, if you just avoid being near an inlet, you are contributing to the greater good of your community. If you are under a permit and mandated to implement best management practices, I encourage you to be aware of what activities are regulated, if that's specified, and then to seek out some type of resource to help you define what those best management practices are going to look like. If you know that information already, you're ahead of the game, and that's great. And you know, it's always good to review this. Most training around these requirements is required under the permit to happen annually. So this may be a refresher for some of you. But if you're asking yourself the question, am I permitted? What activities are regulated? What BMPs do I need? I really encourage you to go and look at your specific agency for more information. So that is my presentation and my training for today. Thank you for your attention and forgiveness with my presentation glitches. And I did, you know, try to allow for about 10 minutes for questions. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to open that up to the group.
Thank you, Colleen. And it looks like there is one question. Are activities such as car washing or power washing considered illicit discharge, and are they punishable?
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. So the answer is it depends. And I hate I hate not giving a definitive answer, but it's going to depend on what the NPDES permit says. So in the state of California, for the permits I work under, and you know, there's several municipal stormwater permits in California. I'm not familiar with every single one of them, but car washing, let's talk about car washing in two categories for a minute. We have residential car washing. So, you know, Saturday afternoon, you pull out your hose and bucket and you wash your car in your driveway. Commercial car washing, you know, a designated facility, you know, most gas station, or not most, but some gas stations have a car washing system, or you have a dealership. They like to keep their cars that they're trying to sell super clean. And so they may have a cycle of car washing. Under the umbrella of commercial car washing, that is 100% prohibited. That wash water cannot go down the storm drain. And it doesn't matter if they use biodegradable soap. It doesn't matter if they treat the water first, in which technically they could get a permit at that point, but no, I don't know that anyone is issuing permits under those circumstances. So the rule of thumb with car washing is it's 100% it's 100% not allowed. Is it subject to fines? Yes. And so the NPDES permit world is a little strange in that that permit is issued to a municipality. And so let's say that there is a city of Stone Creek. They have an MS4 permit. And in that permit, it says, you shall prohibit the discharge of commercial car washing. And actually, it's going to be even more vague. It's going to say, you shall prohibit the discharge of non-stormwater discharges. If there is and so the way the municipal stormwater program works is then I, as a program manager in the city of Stone Creek, have to develop a program to make sure that non-stormwater discharges are prohibited. So I'm going to go to all of my commercial car washing, and let's say I have a permit process. So if you're a commercial car washing and you have and that's an activity at your job, I'm going to say you have to have a permit from the city. I'm going to issue a permit, and it's going to say no discharge down the storm drain. And then those circumstances, if the city or if that commercial car wash discharges water down the storm drain from their car washing activities, I, as the city, am going to have the legal authority to issue them a fine. However, I have a permit as a city that also says I have to prohibit these discharges, and the pollutants that are discharged in my city to my storm drain system become my responsibility under the NPDES federal regulations. So, right, wrong, or indifferent, fair or not fair, this is how that works. So technically, the city could also be fined by the state agency for not complying with their permit. That's rare. But the issue when it comes to fines is if you as a municipality have the legal authority to prohibit these discharges, you have a program to have those discharges abated by your regulated commercial businesses, and they don't follow those practices, yes, they can be fined at the discretion of the city. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but I wanted to kind of parse out these different roles and responsibilities. Okay. Was there another part to that question?
There is, but we unfortunately are running out of time. We have a webinar that has to start in like 5 minutes. Okay. So we're going to have to wrap up this workshop. If you had a question that wasn't answered, go ahead and email Colleen. I believe she showed her email at the beginning of the presentation, or you can email me at coordinator@stormwaterawareness.org, and I can forward that information over to her or send you her email.
I'm putting my email in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So thank you everyone for joining us. We are so glad that you were here. Be sure you check out the rest of the workshops happening this week, and you can find those at stormwaterawareness.org. But a huge thank you to Colleen, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks. Bye-bye.